Welcome to the Darkling Radio, where chilling tales come alive in the dark. From haunted places to true disturbing encounters, every story is told in immersive first-person style to keep you on edge until the very last word. Marcus and Isla had heard the stories, but curiosity pushed them up the dark, winding path of Haunted Hill. What began as a thrill quickly turned into a nightmare, as the hill itself seemed alive, whispering their names and reshaping reality around them in ways no one should ever witness. The first time I saw Haunted Hill, it looked like any other forgotten stretch of land at the edge of town. The road leading up was cracked and uneven, flanked by trees with gnarled branches that scraped against the darkening sky. Even from a distance, the hill gave off a strange presence, as if it were watching, waiting. Locals had whispered stories about it for decades: disappearances, odd lights, muffled cries that carried on the wind, but I had always dismissed them. Curiosity has a way of overpowering reason, and that evening, I found myself pulling my car onto the gravel path at the hill's base. The sun had already begun to sink, painting the horizon in shades of blood red and violet. I stepped out, the air immediately biting against my skin despite the warmth lingering from the day. The silence hit me first. Not the usual quiet of an empty field, but a dense, pressing silence. The kind that makes every creak of a branch sound deafening. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting a narrow path through the encroaching darkness. Every step I took seemed exaggerated, each crunch of gravel underfoot echoing into the still air. The trees on either side of the path were oddly spaced, their branches twisting toward one another, forming archways that seemed almost intentional, like a corridor leading me upward. Shadows danced at the edges of the light, teasing movement that vanished whenever I tried to focus. A chill crawled up my spine, and for a moment, I questioned why I had come alone. But something compelled me to keep going, a pull I couldn't explain, and my feet carried me upward despite the unease settling into my chest. Halfway up, I stumbled upon an old stone marker. Its surface was worn smooth, the inscription nearly impossible to read, but something dark clung to its grooves. As I leaned closer, I noticed the faint outline of a small handprint pressed deep into the rock. It wasn't just weathered stone, it felt fresh, almost wet under my fingertips. I recoiled, convinced I had imagined it, but the sense of being watched had grown unbearable. My head snapped up, and for a brief moment, I caught a pale figure slipping between the trees. I blinked, heart hammering, but it was gone. Nothing remained but the oppressive darkness and the sound of my own shallow breathing. By the time I reached the summit, the sky had surrendered fully to night, leaving only a thin crescent moon overhead. From up here, the town below glimmered with tiny lights, distant and comforting, yet the hill itself felt like an entirely separate world. The air grew colder, denser, pressing against me from all sides. That's when I noticed it. Faint footprints in the dirt, small and shallow, circling the summit. I hadn't seen anyone else, yet they were unmistakable. They curved around an old, crumbling bench near the hilltop, stopping abruptly as if waiting for something or someone. My pulse quickened, an instinct screamed at me to leave, but something about the footprints drew my gaze, an almost magnetic pull I couldn't resist. I took careful steps closer, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The shadows around me seemed to lean forward, reaching, watching. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a strange, almost human sigh that set every nerve on edge. It was as if the hill itself breathed, alive and aware. My reflection in a puddle nearby seemed distorted, the moonlight casting my face in unnatural angles, my own eyes appearing wider, darker. I shook my head, telling myself it was just fatigue, imagination playing tricks, but the hair on my arms stood straight, and I could feel a presence circling just beyond the light. Then, from somewhere behind the bench, I heard a faint scraping sound, low and deliberate, like fingernails dragged across stone. I froze, ears straining, and the sound stopped abruptly. I convinced myself it had been the wind or a falling branch, but my chest tightened, a sense of dread pooling in my stomach. The footprints seemed closer now, as if someone or something had moved while I wasn't looking. I swallowed hard and stepped back, but my feet caught on a hidden root, sending me sprawling onto the dirt. The flashlight rolled, casting its beam across the summit, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw dozens of pale shapes crouched in the shadows, eyes glinting faintly in the moonlight. I scrambled to my feet, heart hammering in my ears, and looked around frantically. The summit was empty again, the town below twinkling innocently, but the sensation of being watched had intensified. The air itself seemed thick with expectation, a slow, oppressive weight that made each breath laborious. And then, just as I thought I might finally calm myself, I noticed it a tiny shoe, worn and caked with dirt, sitting perfectly upright near the bench. It hadn't been there before. And as I stared, the hair on the back of my neck stood on end, because somewhere nearby, soft breathing began. Not wind, not leaves. Breathing. The cold, uneven air of the hill clung to me as I tried to steady my shaking hands. That tiny shoe near the bench seemed impossible, yet there it was, stubbornly rooted in reality. My flashlight quivered in my grip, the beam cutting across the summit like a desperate plea for clarity. But clarity was nowhere to be found. I forced myself to look closer, And that's when I noticed the other objects scattered near the shoes. More cracked dolls, broken toys, fragments of porcelain. They weren't haphazardly thrown. They formed a crude circle, almost ceremonial, each piece deliberately positioned. My stomach churned as I realized these were relics of children, items someone had left or had been left behind. I wanted to back away, but my feet remained planted, glued to the dirt as though the hill had claimed me already. A hollowed-out tree near the bench caught my eye, gaping like a mouth frozen in a scream. Its interior was dark and shadowed, yet something about it beckoned me closer. I stepped forward, every nerve screaming that I shouldn't, but a magnetic pull drew me near. Kneeling, I pointed the flashlight into the hollow, and my stomach dropped. Inside, the air was thick with decay, a damp, metallic temps that made my head swim. The circle of small toys continued within, surrounding an object I couldn't immediately identify. I leaned closer, heart hammering, and my flashlight caught a tiny shoe, identical to the one on the ground outside, polished to an unnatural shine. It seemed almost new, impossibly out of place amid the decay and rot. As I stared, a sound began to echo from deep within the tree. At first, I thought it was tapping, the rhythmic scrape of fingernails on wood, but then it shifted into something else entirely. It was breathing, slow, deliberate, uneven, unmistakably human, yet impossibly soft, like someone exhaling through a thin veil. I froze, convinced my mind was playing tricks, but the sound didn't cease. It grew closer, moving subtly through the hollow, circling around me, and my pulse became a hammering drum in my ears. Panic clawed at the edges of my mind, but I was rooted, unable to look away. Then I noticed the carvings inside the trunk, hundreds of initials etched deep into the wood, layered on top of one another, a chaotic tapestry of names. Some were decades old, worn by time and weather, while others were fresh. The cuts in the wood raw and bleeding faint shadows in the flashlight's beam. My breath caught. Someone or something had been here recently, carving names, leaving traces, and somehow I had walked directly into their space. The air grew colder still, and a shiver raced down my spine as the whispering began. Faint, almost imperceptible. It came from everywhere and nowhere, a chorus of voices murmuring names I didn't recognize, but each syllable carried an unnatural insistence. The small shoe at the center of the circle shifted ever so slightly, and I swore it had moved toward me. My hand lifted to push it aside, but before I could touch it, a shadow flickered across the opening of the hollow. I jerked my head up, heart leaping into my throat, and saw Itan's indistinct figure, small and pale, moving just beyond the edge of my light. It didn't approach, didn't retreat, but it lingered, its presence pressing into my senses like a weight. The whispers intensified, layering into a chant I couldn't understand. Yet the cadence was hypnotic, drawing me closer to the tree despite the terror clawing at my mind. Something brushed my shoulder, cold and insistent, and I spun around. Flashlight slicing through the darkness, only to find empty air. The hill itself seemed to shift, branches bending unnaturally, shadows elongating toward me. The footprints I had seen earlier had returned, now circling the tree in small, deliberate patterns. They appeared freshly pressed into the soft soil, leading away from the bench in a path I hadn't noticed before. Each step I considered taking seemed preordained, a silent instruction I didn't want but couldn't ignore. I took a hesitant step back, and the whispering stopped instantly, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed against my ears. The objects in the tree's hollow seemed to watch me, the dolls' cracked faces and tiny shoes unnervingly lifelike in the flashlight's trembling beam. I realized, with a sinking feeling, that they weren't just objects, they were warnings, remnants of something far older and far crueler than I had ever imagined. The wind shifted suddenly, rattling the trees, and I heard it then. A low, deliberate laugh, soft and childish, yet distorted beyond recognition. It came from everywhere at once, wrapping around me, sinking into my chest, and I stumbled back, tripping over roots as if the hill itself wanted to claim me. I scrambled toward the summit's edge, desperate to leave, but the hollow seemed endless, expanding as if breathing. The tiny shoe at the center of the circle gleamed brighter, impossibly so, catching my eye with a malevolent insistence. And then, with a sudden sharp movement, the air shifted, and I realized with a frozen, primal terror that the shadows around the hollow were moving to hundreds of them, small, hunched, and pale, pressing against the edge of the opening. Their indistinct shapes were almost human, but not entirely, and I understood then, with bone-deep certainty, that whatever lived in this tree had been waiting for me all along. The hill had changed around me, subtly but unmistakably. The path I had climbed earlier now twisted in ways that made no sense, roots stretching across it like serpents, trees leaning in to block my escape. My flashlight flickered, struggling against the oppressive darkness, and the air felt heavier, each breath like inhaling water. The small figures I had glimpsed earlier, those pale, hunched shapes, were no longer confined to the hollowed tree. Shadows moved at the edge of my vision, skittering across the summit, and though I spun around again and again, I could never see them fully. It was as if the hill itself had grown alive, shaping its contours to trap me, reshaping reality around its summit like a predator circling its prey. A low murmuring sound began to rise from the ground, a whispering that seemed to come from everywhere at once. At first I thought it was the wind through the branches, but the cadence was deliberate, rhythmic, almost like chanting. The whispers called my name, though distorted and faint, sending shivers down my spine. My pulse quickened, legs trembling, but despite the fear, some part of me felt compelled to follow the voices, to move closer. My instincts screamed to run, yet my feet carried me toward a clearing I hadn't noticed before. There, the remnants of another small shrine awaited broken dolls, tiny shoes, shards of porcelain, and the faint outline of footprints circling them. Every step I had taken seemed guided by some invisible force, drawing me inexorably toward that circle. I crouched to examine the footprints more closely. They were small, almost childlike, yet some appeared older, deeper, as if made by heavier feet. They overlapped in a chaotic pattern, moving in loops that made no sense. I realized with a sickening certainty that these prints weren't random, they were ritualistic, deliberately placed, and somehow alive. The whispers grew louder, threading together into a phrase I couldn't understand but could feel in my chest. "Join us." My stomach turned, but I couldn't look away. The hill had me in its grip, my curiosity a chain I could not break. Then I saw the bench again, impossibly close, though I had come from the opposite direction. Time itself seemed warped here. Distances no longer followed reason. On the bench rested a notebook, old and cracked, its leather cover flaking in the moonlight. I hesitated, then lifted it, revealing pages filled with cramped handwriting spanning decades. The entries detailed previous visitors to Haunted Hill, each recounting glimpses of figures, whispers, and objects moving impossibly. The final entry was written in jagged, frantic strokes. "They are waiting. Don't look behind." Of course, I looked, my blood ran cold. Behind the bench, just beyond the dim reach of my flashlight, stood dozens of figures, small, pale, hunched over, with faces blurred and shifting like mist. Their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the scant light in the clearing. They didn't move toward me, not yet, but their presence pressed in, a suffocating weight on my chest. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but my body refused. My mind registered the fear, the primal urge to flee, yet I remained rooted, staring as they seemed to whisper and shift in unison. The wind stirred suddenly, rattling the broken trees, and with it came the faintest scent of something sweet and metallic, like blood mixed with decay. I gagged, stumbling back, tripping over the uneven earth. My flashlight flickered violently, casting long exaggerated shadows across the clearing. Each figure seemed to multiply in that chaotic light, bending and stretching like shadows from a nightmare. The whispering became louder, overlapping voices merging into a cacophony. A chorus of countless breaths and half-formed words that clawed at the edges of my sanity. Panic finally broke through my paralysis. I turned to run, stumbling down the hill, but the path warped beneath me, roots tangling with rocks in impossible arrangements. Every step felt longer, slower, the hill stretching like an endless spiral. Branches snapped and scraped at my arms and legs, but I didn't dare stop. The clearing, the bench, the tree, they all appeared behind me again, as though the summit had folded back on itself, trapping me in an unending loop. A sudden sound made me freeze, a soft, deliberate laugh, high-pitched and childlike, yet distorted and hollow. It echoed through the trees, reverberating in my skull, and I realized it wasn't coming from anywhere in particular. It was everywhere. My flashlight caught movement ahead. Another figure, pale, hunched, dragging itself across the summit in jerky, unnatural motions. Its head turned toward me, and I saw for the first time the mouth, wide and empty, too large for its face. I stumbled backward, terror choking me, and my heart raced as I realized that the hill wasn't just alive, it was hunting. The figures advanced slowly, almost lazily, yet I could feel their intent pressing against me. Each step I tried to take away was met with resistance, the hill itself seeming to rise beneath their movement, shaping reality so I could not escape. The whispers turned to chants, a rhythm that reverberated in my chest, guiding me toward the hollowed tree I had encountered earlier. The figures followed, circling, looming, and I understood with a cold, sinking certainty. The hill was preparing me for something, and there was no leaving until it was ready. I ran without thinking, crashing through underbrush and stumbling over roots, the hill seeming to twist around me with every frantic step. The trees bent and swayed in impossible ways, shadows flickering at the edge of my vision, and I realized I had no idea which direction led down. The whispers followed, growing louder, a symphony of voices, distorted and overlapping, calling my name, mocking me, urging me forward. Every instinct screamed to stop, to hide, to run back, but the hill had already claimed my mind. My chest burned with each ragged breath, my legs threatening to collapse under me. Yet some invisible force drove me onward, toward a clearing I had never seen before. There, standing like a sentinel against the darkness, was a small cabin I hadn't noticed earlier. Its walls were blackened, choked by thick ivy, and the door hung crooked ajar. Despite every warning ringing in my head, I felt drawn to it, as though some silent voice promised answers inside. My flashlight flickered and dimmed as I approached, the beam barely reaching the ground, yet I could make out hundreds of markings etched into the walls and doorframe. They were faint, shallow scratches that seemed to writhe when I blinked, like tiny fingers clawing at the wood. A shiver ran down my spine, but I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking underfoot. The air inside the cabin was frigid, unnaturally cold, carrying a scent of mold and decay that made my stomach twist all around me. The walls were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, each capturing a visitor to Haunted Hill, each frozen in fear, each with a shadow creeping across their face, partially obscuring their features. I ran a trembling hand over one photo and felt a chill race up my arm. The faces were real, yet distorted, as if someone had pressed a filter of horror over their expressions. I noticed a chronological pattern. Older photos yellowed and brittle, while newer ones looked disturbingly fresh. And at the center, staring back at me, was a photo of a person standing exactly where I had been on the summit. A mirror leaned against the far wall, tall and narrow, reflecting the cabin's dim interior. At first, my reflection seemed normal, but then it shifted. My eyes widened unnaturally, the skin of my face, pulling mouth stretching into a faint, crooked smile that I did not intend. Behind me, shadows pressed against the mirror, indistinct figures with elongated limbs and hollowed faces, fingers reaching outward, mouths opening in silent screams. I spun around, heart hammering, but the cabin appeared empty, silent except for the faint whispering in the walls. The mirror reflected what was no longer there, a version of the summit that existed only in the realm of shadows. I stumbled back, nearly toppling the photographs, and something shifted in the darkness behind me. A soft scraping sound, like fingernails on wood, circled the cabin, moving just beyond my field of vision. The whispers grew frantic, overlapping, a chorus of dozens of voices all speaking at once. My flashlight flickered again, casting long, grotesque shadows across the walls. I realized with a sickening clarity that the cabin itself was alive, watching me, guiding me, trapping me. Every step I had taken on the hill had been leading to this moment, to this room filled with eyes that weren't entirely human, reflections that weren't entirely me. The floor beneath me seemed to pulse slightly, subtle but unmistakable, like the heartbeat of the hill itself. I tried to move toward the door, but my legs refused to respond properly, as if invisible hands held them in place. The photographs on the walls seemed to shift, the shadows in each image growing darker, stretching, bending toward me. The whispers became chants, a rhythm vibrating through my skull. I understood then that the cabin was a prison, a stage, a lure for anyone foolish enough to climb Haunted Hill at night. The hill fed on fear, on obsession, on the need to see what should never be seen. I turned to the mirror again, hoping to find some escape, and froze. My reflection was gone. In its place stood countless figures, small and hunched, faces blurred, eyes faintly glowing. They pressed forward, yet they did not leave the glass. My own hands lifted reflexively, pressing against the surface, but it was solid, unyielding, a barrier between me and some otherworldly prison. I felt the weight of dozens of unseen eyes on my back, and I realized with bone-deep terror that I was no longer alone. Something was moving behind the cabin, stalking me, circling me, waiting for the moment I faltered. A sudden gust rattled the cabin, sending the photographs fluttering like trapped birds. The shadows pressed harder against the mirror, and I understood with a gutsick certainty that leaving the cabin would not mean leaving the hill. Haunted Hill had already claimed me, reshaped reality, and the summit, the tree, the hollow, and the bench hall were part of its design. I felt a presence brush my shoulder, cold and deliberate, and when I looked, there was nothing but I knew, with absolute certainty, that the hill itself was smiling, patient and inexorable, waiting to draw me further into its dark heart. Panic clawed at me, and I stumbled blindly out of the cabin, the hill twisting under my feet, roots snaring me, branches clawing at my arms and face. The moon had slipped behind thick clouds, leaving the summit drenched in unnatural darkness. The whispers had grown to a deafening chorus, layered and overlapping, each voice echoing my own name, calling me back, drawing me deeper into the hill's twisted embrace. I ran, desperate, my legs burning, heart hammering in my chest, but every step seemed to stretch the distance before me, the hill elongating and twisting, trapping me in a maze I could never escape. The summit reappeared, impossibly close yet unfamiliar, reshaped into something alien. The stone marker, the hollow tree, the crumbling bench, they were gone. In their place, a small figure crouched, bathed in a pale, unearthly glow. My breath caught in my throat. As I approached, my heart threatened to explode. The figure turned slowly, and for a moment my vision blurred with disbelief. It was me, or at least a version of me. Hollow eyes, skin unnaturally pale, and a smile twisted into something both familiar and monstrous. It stepped closer, each movement deliberate, almost playful, yet every motion dripped with malice. The hill around me groaned and shifted. Shadows stretched, multiplying, wrapping around my legs, pressing against my chest. I tried to run, but the ground beneath my feet had become something else entirely, dark, sticky, pulsing faintly, as if the hill itself had veins, arteries, a heartbeat. The The whispers now merged into a single voice, my own voice, distorted, echoing with a timbre that was both mine and not mine. "Join us," it hissed, and in that moment I realized the horrifying truth. The hill did not merely trap people, it recreated them, molding them into its own endless chorus of shadows, whispers, and hollow faces. I scrambled backward, hands grasping at roots and rocks, but the hill had altered reality so completely that the path downward no longer existed. Trees leaned impossibly inward, forming a cage of limbs, their branches pressing in like bars. The figures multiplied, emerging from shadows, from the air itself. Hundreds of small, hunched shapes, their eyes glowing faintly, faces blurred and shifting, circled me in silence, and each step I took brought me closer to their center. My own reflection, or the twisted version of myself, mirrored my panic, yet remained calm, patient, watching me with those hollow eyes. A sudden gust of wind carried a chorus of childish laughter, warped and hollow, echoing across the summit. It wrapped around my mind, pulling me into dizzying vertigo. I could feel the hill bending, curving upward and downward simultaneously, the summit stretching endlessly in every direction, and beneath me I glimpsed it, the town below, distorted, shrouded in shadow, its lights flickering weakly like dying stars. The world I had known no longer existed. Only the hill remained, and it hungered for me to step fully into its embrace. The figure that was me or not me stepped closer, and I could see now that the hands were elongated, fingers unnaturally thin, reaching toward me with deliberate patience. I fell backward, tumbling across the summit, my flashlight rolling away, beams scattering in frantic arcs across the hilltop. The small shoes, dolls, and shards of porcelain from the previous clearings floated in midair, suspended as if by some invisible tether, circling the hill like offerings in a dark ritual. My heart raced as I realized that every step I had taken, every object I had seen, every shadow I had glimpsed, had been designed to guide me here, to prepare me for this final transformation. I scrambled to my feet and ran, though I no longer knew what direction was down or even real. The whispers had become my heartbeat, matching every pulse in my chest, the laughter now a thunderous accompaniment. The figures followed, gliding, crawling, and leaping with unnatural grace, always behind me, never stopping. I glanced over the edge, or what I thought was the edge, and my stomach dropped. The hill had no boundary. The ground spiraled endlessly into darkness, a void filled with floating remnants of every soul it had claimed. Tiny shoes, dolls, toys, photographs, and shards of porcelain, all suspended in midair, spinning slowly in a dance of eternal torment. I tried to scream, but my voice was absorbed, swallowed by the hill. The figure that was me reached out, fingers brushing my shoulder, and the whispers became my own voice, speaking in countless tones at once, echoing in every corner of my mind. I realized then, with the coldest certainty, that I would never leave. The hill had claimed me, reshaped me, and would now hold me as it had held so many before. My own reflection, my own identity, would join the chorus, a hollow face among countless others, whispering in the darkness for eternity. And as I looked down into the endless void, the hill itself seemed to smile. I was still there, suspended in that unholy spiral, my own shoes floating beside countless others. My voice joined the laughter, the whispers, the chanting, and the hill waited patiently for the next curious soul to climb, unaware that I was no longer merely a visitor. I had become part of the hill, and Haunted Hill would never let me go.